In 20 years, Capcom made full-on remakes of their first 4 Resident Evil games, and we recently got interesting rumors about the next remakes to come, with leaker Dusk Golem reporting that Resident Evil 0 and Code Veronica are in development. Besides that, we have nothing, but I think it's worth looking into how the Resident Evil franchise has been remade so far to better know what to expect. Last year, I played all of them back to back, over Halloween, actually.
Oh no. What's that noise?
And I realized how each of these remakes is very unique, not only in how it chose to reimagine the original game, but also in the type of horror experience it provides to the player. So let's dive into the 4 shades of horror we can find in all of the Resident Evil remakes. We tend to forget this, but the first 3 original Resident Evil games were actually very close to one another. They were literally released over the course of 3 years, between 1996 and 1999. Now, of course, each sequel added things like more exploration, more abilities, more enemies, and usually a bit more action. But what made the essence of each game was very similar. First, the graphics and artistic direction were obviously close to one another, which led to a fairly similar feel when exploring the Spencer Mansion, RCPD Police Station, or the Clock Tower, for example. But more importantly, the gameplay, which was the main process through which we experienced fear in those games, was very similar. Pre-rendered backgrounds, tank controls, limited resources, intricate environments, and an overall limited range of action our characters could perform. And this is why all 3 games were pure survival horror games. What created tension was the player's constant fear that they might not survive the next encounter, because they have wasted too many resources, didn't bring the right ones, haven't saved their game in a while, or because they couldn't control the character efficiently enough to avoid enemies or attacks. It's only with Resident Evil 4, arguably Code Veronica, that something changed profoundly in how horror would be experienced in the series. We would get a more intense cinematographic experience, more action, more characters, and more importance given to the plot, the narrative flow, and the deranging atmosphere of the setting and its inhabitants. But the first 3 games were really coherent, and everyone knew what to expect when it came to the trilogy that defines survival horror. The remakes, on the other hand, were developed in a very different context, and in my opinion, this led to much more diversity and nuances in how horror was remade in those games. The first Resident Evil remake is already more than 20 years old, releasing first on 2002 in GameCube and more recently remastered cross-platform in 2015. Because it was released only 6 years after the original, this remake is the one that stuck the most closely to the type of horror originally conveyed, but not quite. The roots of the series are very much kept. It's true that we can choose modern controls over the tank ones, and we also have a defensive move giving better chances of surviving encounters, but the core gameplay still makes it a very true survival horror game. Fixed cameras, challenging inventory management, intricate corridors, and overall little room for error, or at least the impression that we have none. What changed the most, however, and which effectively contributed to the type of horror encountered, is simply the artistic direction. More than the originals, Resident Evil 1 Remake became what I will call a true atmospheric survival horror game. In the original game, the mansion itself was already a major part of the horror experience, a claustrophobic labyrinth in which you never knew what to expect. In the remake, this is turned into a true atmospheric gothic experience. What is typically considered as simple technological improvements in remakes actually has a major role in the scares and the tension we feel as we explore once again Spencer Mansion. An unexpected flash followed by thunderstruck, dancing shadows in the corner of a room, strange noises we cannot quite pinpoint spatially. The artistic direction is phenomenal in this remake, and it was definitely what developers went for. In an interview, Shinji Mikami explained how his main focus when developing the game was on, I quote, graphics, atmosphere, character motion, and especially effects, bloods and weapons, expressions of fire and water. And Hiroyuki Kobayashi added how one of their main concepts was, I quote again, to make people feel that you can actually touch things. In other words, we still have in this remake true survival horror wrapped in a thick atmosphere, making every step in the mansion a terrorizing yet beautiful experience. Some are debating today whether Capcom should come up with a new Resident Evil 1 remake that would integrate the over-the-shoulder gameplay included in the modern remakes of episodes 2 and 3. While it could make for a great game, I'm afraid it would mean completely abandoning the true survival horror roots of the original trilogy. Because that's what I argue happened with Resident Evil 2 Remake. Don't get me wrong, it is an amazing game, and in my opinion, the best Resident Evil remakes so far. But it's not because it stuck to survival horror. It's a there are eyes everywhere type of horror. And no, I'm not only talking about this guy.
No, let me go.
In the original trilogy, in the first remake, the tank controls and fixed cameras created a sense of unknown and helplessness that allowed for tension to build up and be maintained. What are we expecting around this corner? What am I hearing that I cannot see? How's the room layout? If a zombie shows up, will I have enough room to run around it? In Resident Evil 2 Remake, we feel much more in control. Resources feel less scarce, we have more liberty of movements as well as defensive moves and items. Many areas have more space or options to avoid enemies, and of course the over-the-shoulder camera that you can control allow you to plan your routes a bit more safely. Or so we think. Where the game excels is that despite giving you more control and power, we still constantly feel on edge. Not because of limited room for action or vision, but because we feel stalked. You know there are enemies, you know they're waiting for you, you just can't see them, and you don't want to. Our CPD station is not as gloomy and atmospheric as Spencer mentioned in Resident Evil 1 Remake, but it's much more alive. Weird movements across windows or in the ceilings, enemies who know exactly when to be quiet and when not.
Ah, Jesus! She's back.
The sound design is brilliant. Zombies on purpose don't make a noise until you're literally just around the corner or passing them by. Their movements and locations are also very difficult to predict. I've had multiple situations where I escaped a zombie when exploring another part of the station, and when I came back expecting to see it in the same place, it was not. So I thought it left or despawned or whatever, but no, it's just a bit further in another dark corner waiting for me in silence. And here it provokes more than jump scares. It creates over time that feeling that enemies see you while you can't, and you're hoping very strongly you'll slip by. Like Sherry, hiding from Chief Irons. After a while, you kill all the zombies, you're more familiar with the place, and then Mr. X comes. First appearance is just like in the original. You avoid him, you run away, and you kind of expect scripted appearances here and there, or patterns to understand and exploit. But no, he stalks you. You know he is somewhere in the station, you hear his footsteps, but you can feel you have no way of anticipating his movements or evading him. And again, you have more control than in the original. If you make no noise, avoid confrontation with other zombies, you can hope he won't hear you and will leave you alone. Until he doesn't. And you hear him come close to you, and you're stuck, a grown man, almost 40, being too afraid to leave the captain's office for 3 days. I kept opening the game, loading my save, hoping Mr. X is gone, just to hear his footsteps again, and turning off my PlayStation. This feeling is different than survival horror. It's stalker horror to its finest. You don't even dare open the door, knowing full well that someone is out there watching you and waiting for you to make the tiniest mistake. What Resident Evil 2 Remake did here was basically to take a small but super promising aspect of the original game and capitalize on it so much that it becomes the main mechanism through which horror is experienced. It felt fresh, but wasn't confusing at all to players who remembered their experience with the original. And that's where Resident Evil 3 Remake disappointed many people, because it went against many expectations. Now, the original Resident Evil 3 was more action-oriented than its prequels to begin with, and also had more tools to survive. More resources and ammo, an evade move, a quick turn, but beyond that the gameplay and overall feel remained close to the previous entries. What really changed and made this game so beloved is Nemesis. This invincible tyrant creature that stalks you for a large part of the game. A creature forcing you to run, find escape routes, and master evade moves if you want to see the end of the story. In the remake, fans expected Nemesis to be bigger, better, meaner than in the original. They didn't want Jill and Carlos calling Nemesis a pussy. I understand that. The writing could have been a bit more subtle here. The problem is, Capcom already played the Stalker card with Mr. X in Resident Evil 2 Remake. The timeline behind both remakes is important to keep in mind here. Both games were released only 1 year apart, respectively in 2019 and 2020. And as Resident Evil 3's producer Pete Fabiano made very clear, I quote, Resident Evil 3 was in active development for 3 years and had some overlap with Resident Evil 2's development. In fact, what the Resident Evil 2 team was doing with Mr. X helped inform the Resident Evil 3 team's work on Nemesis. And even if the Resident Evil 3 team had tried to stick to the original role given to Nemesis, would they have been able to top what Resident Evil 2 Remake did with Mr. X without making it seem redundant? I'm not so sure about that, and that's why I actually respect and enjoyed the other direction they went for. The more easygoing, character-driven, action-oriented, post-apocalyptic experience Resident Evil 3 Remake provided. My feeling when playing Resident Evil 3 was similar to watching a season of The Walking Dead or my favorite Romero movie. Quiet moments of narrative build-up and character development, some suspenseful exploration, followed by intense fights for survival and moments of badassery. The laboratory scene, where we have to cope with a horde of zombies forcing their way into the building, is typical of your zombie flick popcorn-worthy scene. What allowed this, I think, is really how the remake reimagined and effectively used the urban environment, moving away from the original. Yes, we don't get to explore a tangled labyrinth of narrow streets in the city as much as in the original game. Although there are fewer exterior spaces to explore, they are a bit more open, thus making it harder to know exactly where the enemies will come from. This urban experience, typical of your post-apocalyptic zombie movie, is rendered, in my opinion, in a pretty immersive way. Interior spaces are also pretty good in general. The hospital, in terms of atmosphere and frights, is, I believe, among the best locations in any of the modern Resident Evil remakes. It just nailed the homage to these types of settings in urban zombie films like 28 Days Later and World War Z. Now yes, it's an absolute shame that important locations like the clock tower have been scrapped. But the clock tower was originally your typical claustrophobic, riddle-filled Resident Evil location already seen in the first 2 remakes. I understand how this choice disappointed many, especially given how short the remake ended being overall, but it seems to me coherent with the post-apocalyptic urban direction Resident Evil 3 Remake took. Like other settings of the genre, another thing that is unique to this third remake that I would actually have liked to see more of in the second remake is character development. Developers mention how it was clearly a conscious narrative choice. And I quote, "We also wanted to bring out more of the characterizations, especially the growing partnership between Jill and Carlos. Was it well made? Yes, I think so. Jill is classier than ever, Carlos much more fleshed out than in the original, and we get into this kind of flirty but also badass chemistry between both that really takes the narration a step further. Other side characters are also well rendered, especially Nikolai. But was it what fans wanted? No. Does it necessarily make it a disappointing remake or a bad Resident Evil game? I don't think so either. It just took a direction not a lot of us were expecting, which is something risky to do in a remake, but it is something worth trying every once in a while, even if it will be a bit more divisive. Take Resident Evil 4, which was exactly what everyone expected and hoped for. No big controversial changes from the original, but an attention to detail that not only enhanced but sublimed the original game's legacy. Like the original game, Resident Evil 4 Remake is obviously the most action-packed of all 4 remakes. Third-person view, many weapons, open areas giving a lot of flexibility in how we want to approach hordes of enemies, a merchant to buy ammo, guns, and other items from, and an overall narrative progression forcing the player into action-packed gunfights. If a genre was to be given to the original game, many would have called it action horror or something like that. But the remake shows how another type of horror was hidden beneath the surface. If there is one thing Resident Evil 4 Remake focused all of its attention on, is on its presentation. Graphics, of course, but more importantly art direction, ambience, sound design, and what I want to call more broadly the game's cinematography, the ability to tell a story extremely efficiently through its visuals. The technical and artistic quality of the game of course help with action and immersion, but contribute even more to the story-driven segments of the game. Now, a cinematic vision was already at the core of the original game back in 2002, but it is in the remake so good and so polished that some aspects that we could easily lose sight of in the original game become much more visible in the remake. Resident Evil 4 is first and foremost a good old thriller. Dark settings, sects, murder, sacrifices, all through the lens of Leon's investigation, a character who is pretty much a typical cop or detective figure in that game. Again, technically, these elements were already all there in the original, but the way they are told in the remake really put them at the center of how most of the horror is conveyed. The opening sequence is much more slow-paced, atmospheric and dark than in the original, and the monsters that we encounter are quickly revealed to be much more human than anything else we have seen in any previous Resident Evil games. Some of the horror stems from the real psychology not only of the antagonists, like Salazar, but also of our protagonists. The encounters with deranged and deranging characters are scripted, edited, and acted so powerfully that you feel you're witnessing some of the most tense moments of True Detective, Hannibal, or Mindhunter. The most frightening moments are not when there are jump scares, but when you discover yet another creepy place in which unimaginable things must have happened or could happen. It was already all there in the original game, but Resident Evil 4's new cinematography really enhanced the writing and overall narrative progression to remind us that behind all of the action and ugly parasites, most of the thrills come from ambience, psychology, and storytelling, like any good old thriller. So let's recap things. Resident Evil 1 Remake went all in with atmospheric horror. Resident Evil 2 played the Stalker card 100%. Resident Evil 3 switched to a much more urban post-apocalyptic type of horror, and Resident Evil 4 sublimed the psychological thriller potential of the original game. What's interesting is that the 3 remakes that are considered the best ones are also the ones that didn't change too much the type of horror they were building compared to the original. They realized or optimized a vision that was already visible in their original counterparts. But at the same time, all 4 remakes lessened a little bit their survival roots. They all became a bit more forgiving and accessible in terms of combats, inventory management, and progression. So it will be very interesting to see how Capcom will handle the next remakes. For Code Veronica, which, like Resident Evil 4, also placed lots of emphasis on the psychology of the antagonists, it could be interesting to have a psychological horror type of take on things, although the gameplay will be closer to Resident Evil 2 and 3 Remake. For Resident Evil 0, besides the gameplay experiments they will make around the 2 characters we can switch between in the original game, I believe the remake could benefit from the care given to Resident Evil 3 when it comes to character development. So again, I guess I'd imagine something a bit more exploration and action-oriented than in the original. In any case, I think Capcom will find interesting ways to honor and hopefully subvert a little our expectations in the remakes to come. I'd love to know what you guys think, so don't hesitate to leave a comment here or connect with me elsewhere, and thanks for watching. Cheers!